Hello everyone, I'm Mauro Cristeche. I'm an associate researcher at the National Research Council of Argentina and a lecturer at the University of La Plata. I'm very happy to present my work about the universal basic income in Latin America and the Caribbean as an alternative to address the socioeconomic effects of the COVID-19 crisis. And I'd like to start with a brief panorama of the situation in the region. The pandemic arrived in a context of low growth and high poverty, inequality, and vulnerability. Many countries were already in economic crisis. As you probably know, the pandemic has strongly affected Latin America, exposing all its structural problems, especially its fragmented labor markets and its weak social protection systems. With only around 9% of the world's population, it accounts for 28% of COVID-19 deaths. And the region has suffered the worst recession in a century, a 7.7% contraction in regional GDP in 2020. Both international and local human rights institutions warned of the unequal social impact of the pandemic and urged states to adopt a series of urgent measures to ensure that the human rights were protected and fulfilled during the crisis. They committed of starting with those at the bottom, or empezar por los de abajo, a slogan adopted by the Argentinian government, is an interesting starting point to see how governments responded to protect the vulnerable sectors, especially because addressing the situation of the informal and unemployed sectors was a fundamental challenge in the region. Since March 2020, governments have created or extended many cash transfer policies to help these sectors, and we have seen different responses. If we take the example of Mexico and Brazil, analyzed by Lustig and Trasberg, both countries saw a huge rise in inequality and poverty, but Brazil's government expanded cash transfers, provided an important income floor for the population, and its fiscal stimulus was among the highest in the region. On the contrary, the Mexican government's response was among the lowest, leaving most of its people without active government support. I have particularly analyzed the emergency family income created by the Argentinian government. It consisted in a benefit of 146 American dollars to each household, and that was granted only 3 times since March 2020. So if we consider the entire year, the benefit was less than $40 monthly to each household. Beyond its wide coverage, it reached 9 million families, and although it wasn't the only emergency policy implemented, the IFE was a very precarious aid, and in fact the protection of the formal sector was much more intense than that of the vulnerable sectors, and this happened not only in Argentina but in most countries. In May 2020, the Economic Commission for Latin America and the Caribbean, a United Nations institution, launched a bold proposal of an emergency basic income. The initiative was based on the diagnosis that it would take a lot of time to control the pandemic and that there was a definite risk of a dramatic increase in poverty. The proposal consisted of a monthly benefit equivalent to the minimum wage of each country for a period of at least 3 months, but ideally 6 or 12 months, and it would have benefited 215 million people, 35% of the regional population. In the graph below, we can see the different proposals. On average, the cost of the EBI varies between a minimum of 1.7% of GDP for a benefit equivalent to a poverty line for 3 months for all persons below the line of poverty, and then a maximum of 9.8% of GDP for a benefit equivalent to a poverty line for 6 months for all persons, and it would be the case of a universal policy. In Argentina, the proposal would have applied to approximately 12 million people. The benefit would be the equivalent of the legal minimum salary of $250 paid to every adult for a period of 6 months, and an average household of 2 adults and 2 children would have received 2 EBI and 2 universal child allowance in order to reach the poverty line of $660 per month, and it would have amounted to around 6% of GDP. Unfortunately, this proposal from the United Nations Commissions wasn't implemented in any country. It wasn't a real universal basic income, but it was a strong plan that would have helped to effectively protect people from poverty and to avoid the growth of inequality around the region. Instead, the emergency policies implemented have reached a wide coverage, nearly 50% of the population, but they have been very precarious. We can see in the graphs below that there was no country where the amounts of the cash transfer policies reached the poverty line, and in only few cases they were above the extreme poverty line. These emergency policies help to mitigate the negative impact of the crisis on the vulnerable sector. I mean, without any help, the situation would have been much worse, but it is also true, it is evident, these policies have been extremely precarious and insufficient to halt the increase of poverty and the growth of inequality. Here we can see how many more resources would have been needed to implement the Commission proposal for 6 or 12 months. In any case, the imperative to devote the maximum available resources for the full protection of the vulnerable sectors wasn't met. The region spent only 1.5% GDP in emergency cash transfers, and the vulnerable sectors have been, comparatively, the least helped and who have suffered the most the effects, the impact of the pandemic. As a result, around 210 million people in Latin America and the Caribbean were living in poverty by the end of 2020. It means a 12-year setback in poverty and a 20-year setback in extreme poverty. In the case of Argentina, poverty had already increased from 25% to 35% of the population between 2018 and 2019, but during the pandemic it reached 42% of the population, with almost 60% of children today being poor. Beyond this panorama, and that none of the Latin American countries implemented a policy on the scale proposed by the United Nations Commission in a context that clearly merited it, but the proposal of the universal basic income somehow appeared on regional agenda. Some colleagues and specialists were too optimistic at the beginning, but the debate is still nascent compared to other regions, and it appeared mainly in academia and the social media and the mass media. In some countries, such as Argentina, Brazil, and Colombia, the proposal even penetrated the institutional sphere. For example, the Argentinian Minister of Social Development argued that the UBI was in the government agenda, but at least in Latin America, the rise of views promoting the role of the state and welfare policies was much stronger than those supporting the universal basic income. In 2021, the United Nations Commission has insisted with the proposal of an emergency basic income for the region as a transitional measure towards the main goal of a universal basic income within the framework of the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. It has argued that in the short term it is necessary to implement the EBI proposed by the Commission plus other emergency policies, especially for women. While in the medium and long term, countries should go towards a real universal basic income committed to comprehensive and sustainable social protection systems, increasing their coverage as a central component of a new welfare state. The historic and current socioeconomic problems make it necessary to implement a measure such as the EBI or the UBI, because Latin America is one of the most unequal regions in the world and suffering macroeconomic vulnerability and structural and serious socioeconomic problems. So the region experiences a massive and systematic process of violation of human rights. And human rights remain in that context artificial. And what is more, there will be long-term impacts of the pandemic, and the precarious and unemployed sectors have not only suffered disproportionately the impact of the crisis until now, but they are also the ones that will have the greatest difficulty in recovering. So the question is, how long will it take for the states to be able to fulfill the human rights of the mass of the population who daily suffer poverty, precariousness, and human rights violations, with traditional proposals such as more growth, more creation of jobs, and so on. Maybe decades, right? So, the universal basic income appears to be a comprehensive and reasonable response to address the challenges included in the Agenda 2030 in terms of poverty, inequality, decent work, tax regimes, gender inequality, sustainable development, and international cooperation. It is a holistic proposal that seeks to substantially modify the capital-labor relationship. It would not only allow the working class to have a greater share in the appropriation of the wealth and to improve its material conditions, but also to try to overcome or to solve the fragmentation of the working class, which is one of the most important political challenges. Even though the debate on UBI implementation finds a favorable scenario for its consideration as a real alternative, it is also evident that the obstacles to make it real are huge and many. Firstly, the pandemic confirmed that the welfare policies to protect vulnerable sectors are extremely precarious, and a radical change is needed in this sphere. But it is also true that the region has an extended social protection system, so we don't have to start from zero. Secondly, it is urgent to address the problem of the tax systems that explain, at least partially, persistent high inequality in the region. There were some exceptional tax to the richest during the pandemic, for example in Argentina, but in general tax systems are mainly based on regressive taxes and don't work as an instrument for the redistribution. So to implement universal basic income, it will be necessary to implement a radical tax reform and to tackle tax evasion, which is huge in Latin America, around 6% of GDP. Thirdly, the fragmentation of the working class. Some authors suggest the need for the elite to become aware of the structural inequality and injustices, and of course a broader consensus will be needed, but the problem might not be the rich but the poor. The problem might be that the working class must act politically in order to meet its demands. Human rights institutions can promote policies, but if the population doesn't push to impose its demands, it will be difficult to meet them. Finally, and among many other issues, it will be important to address the environmental challenges that the UBI brings. Is this policy environmentally sustainable? Well, for this, I think we should think not only about the increase of consumption, but what changes are necessary in the production system and many other questions. In summary, if we look at the Latin America and the Caribbean reality, it is clear that to resolve most of the problems that affect the working class and especially its vulnerable sectors in a reasonable period of time, the time is a crucial factor here, and to achieve somehow the United Nations goals, radical changes will be needed. And the universal basic income could be one of the keys to open and go through that process. What we have seen is that the emergency policies implemented during the pandemic were very precarious and didn't express a political will for the implementation of a UBI around the region, at least in the near future. Governments have prioritized aid to the formal sector, which in reality means aid to capital, and the vulnerable sectors haven't been able to strongly intervene to impose their demands for social protections. But beyond these precedents, this extraordinary situation and the proposal launched by the United Nations Commission have opened a favorable field to push the debates on the UBI. So again, is this universal policy a realistic alternative in this context for Latin America and the Caribbean? I think it could be in the sense that the UBI would help to tackle most of the socioeconomic problems that the region faces, and there are not many other options. But on the other hand, it doesn't appear realistic because the political conditions to implement this policy are not present. A deep social transformation will be needed, and the possibilities for it depend not only on macroeconomic conditions and technical analysis about its convenience, but fundamentally on the intervention of the working class movements. Thank you for listening, and feel free to make comments or to ask questions.